We are told the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel is a direct link to royalty, a breed preserved untouched since the days of King Charles II, but the DNA tells a completely different story. It wasn't preserved, it was manufactured. In this video, we're peeling back the layers of this royal history to reveal how this breed was actually reconstructed from scratch to look the part, and why the secret hidden in their genes changes everything we know about their true ancestry. That is where the mystery begins, because if a breed has to be reassembled from an image, what exactly was lost before the rescue began? What disappeared from the living population that made a prize necessary in the first place? And why did the desired face of this dog become so closely tied to portraits, legends, and the soft authority of aristocratic memory? The answer is not sitting in one elegant portrait alone. It is buried in the tension between appearance and ancestry, between what looks old and what has been carefully rebuilt to look old. A dog with a noble expression can hide a history of interruption. A familiar silhouette can be the result of choices made much later than people assume. In this case, the romance of a royal lapdog began to overpower the record of how the modern breed truly emerged. And that gap is where the real story lives. Think about the power of that image for a moment. A small companion on a velvet cushion, linked to kings, painted into memory, carried forward as if tradition itself had guarded it. Yet the very need for Eldridge's prize reveals that the line had not remained fixed. The dogs admired in the early 20th century no longer matched the older ideal closely enough, so breeders were asked to search backward through type, not simply forward through descent. The goal was not to conserve a perfect relic, it was to rebuild a resemblance. That difference is everything. A preserved breed and a recreated breed do not tell the same story, even when they share the same name. One suggests survival, the other suggests intention. And the Cavalier King, Charles Spaniel, sits exactly in that tension, wearing the face of antiquity while carrying the fingerprints of modern selection. If you have ever looked at this breed and felt there was something almost ceremonial about its expression, that feeling is part of the puzzle. The name evokes ceremony, the coat evokes refinement, and the old courtly associations make it easy to imagine a direct descent from palace to present day. But the trail leading to 1926 shows something more deliberate and more human. Someone had to decide what old type meant. Someone had to measure the past against an image. Someone had to believe that a spaniel from history could be recovered through breeding choices alone. And once you see that, the next question becomes unavoidable. What happened between the romantic legend and the genetic reality that followed? Because if the modern Cavalier King Charles Spaniel was built to resemble an older ideal, the DNA may tell a different story about what was mixed, lost, and rebuilt along the way. In 1928, the story stopped being only a memory and became an organization. After Roswell Eldridge died, a group of breeders came together and formed the first club devoted to the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, giving shape to a wish that had already moved beyond admiration. What had started as a challenge in a show ring now needed rules, agreement, and a shared idea of what the breed should look like when it was finally pulled back into view. That detail matters because the Kennel Club did not treat this as the return of a pure survivor from the old court. At first, it recorded the dogs as King Charles Spaniels, Cavalier type. Even the name carried hesitation. It sounded provisional, almost like a note written in the margin of a larger history. The identity of the breed was not declared all at once. It was negotiated, step by step, through people who had to decide which outline belonged to the past and which features belonged to the future. Inside that first club, the work was not about preserving a vanished dog exactly as it had been. It was about stabilizing an image that could be bred, repeated, and defended. Breeders had to compare dogs, argue over skull shape, measure muzzle length, and examine the expression that made one animal seem closer to the desired ideal than another. Every choice narrowed the field. Every pairing pushed the line toward a more specific face. The breed was taking form not as inheritance alone, but as intention made visible, and once that process began, the romantic picture of a continuous aristocratic bloodline started to crack. The earliest supporters were not uncovering a hidden relic. They were assembling a version of history that could survive in the present. A selection program always leaves fingerprints, even when it tries to imitate something older than itself. In this case, the fingerprint was visible in the very language used to describe the dogs. Not simply King Charles Spaniels, but King Charles Spaniels, Cavalier type, a classification with a gap inside it. That gap reveals the tension at the heart of the breed's formation. The ideal came first as desire, then as standard, then as a community willing to reproduce the same look again and again. What appears at a glance to be a family line is, on closer inspection, a carefully assembled return. The small head, the soft eyes, the gentle presence in the lap. Each feature had to be kept alive through repeated human decisions. Nothing about that process was automatic. Nothing about it was untouched. Beyond the show ring standards, this reconstruction had physiological consequences. As noted by Dr. Claire Rusbridge in the Journal of Veterinary Internal Medicine, 2004, the drive for specific aesthetics fundamentally altered the breed's biological baseline. In 1945, the paper line was finally drawn. The Kennel Club did not merely admire the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel from a distance, it formally recognized it as a distinct breed, separating it from the King Charles Spaniel. That single decision changed everything that came before it, because it confirmed that the refined little companion people thought they were preserving had already become something else in the eyes of the institution that defined legitimacy. The detail matters. A name can float for years in the world of show rings, private breeding rooms, and revived ideals, but official recognition fixes the silhouette in law and custom. From that moment, the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel was no longer just a nostalgic variation living beside another spaniel. It stood apart. It had its own place, its own standard, its own future to be protected. And that separation exposed how much effort had gone into making the dog look continuous before it was ever allowed to be separate. This is where the romantic image starts to crack in a more precise way. If the breed had truly remained untouched, there would be no need for such a formal division. The very act of recognition suggests uncertainty, debate, and a need to settle identity on paper after the fact. The Cavalier King Charles Spaniel was being defined not only by what it resembled, but by what breeders, judges, and the Kennel Club agreed it should become. That is not the language of preservation alone, it is the language of selection becoming official. And once that happened, every feature carried a different weight. The soft expression, the compact body, the graceful outline, even the contrast with the flatter-faced King Charles Spaniel beside it. None of that was just decoration. It was evidence that a desired image had been stabilized so thoroughly that it could survive as a named, separated entity. What had begun as revival now had administrative boundaries. What had looked like ancestral continuity now had to answer to a modern standard. There is a subtle force in that kind of recognition. It tells you that a breed is not only born in fields, homes, or kennels. Sometimes it is born in the moment a committee agrees to stop calling it a variation. And in 1945, the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel crossed that threshold. The result was not a return to an untouched lineage, but the official sealing of a reconstruction already in motion. That is why the date matters as much as the dog itself. 1945 is not just a marker on a timeline, it is the moment when intention became institution. The Cavalier King Charles Spaniel moved from being a cultivated preference to a formally recognized identity, and in doing so it revealed the hidden truth inside its own charm. This was a breed made legible by human choice. So when you see the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel now, with that calm face and courtly bearing, you are not looking at a relic rescued intact from royal history. You are looking at a modern agreement shaped to resemble an older ideal, and that difference is exactly what gives the breed its power. It is not less meaningful because it was separated in 1945. It is more revealing. The official split shows how far people were willing to go to turn nostalgia into a living standard, and how a beloved image can become real only after institutions decide to name it. If this breakdown helped you see the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel in a new light, consider subscribing and checking the link below for more deep dives into breed ancestry. This data forces us to reconsider the breed's legacy. It is not a relic of royal history, but a modern outcome of intense, institutionalized selection. If this detail changes the way you read the breed, keep going with that feeling, because the next layer goes beyond recognition and into the logic of how the appearance itself was locked into place. That is where the reconstruction stops looking accidental and starts looking deliberate enough to carry a legacy. In 1956, a small handoff changed the direction of the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. W. Lyon Brown brought the first one from the United States into the United Kingdom, and that crossing did more than move an animal across an ocean. It opened a new phase in which the once carefully rebuilt companion began to circulate again in the country that had first turned it into an ideal. The detail sounds modest, almost administrative, until you notice what it really means. The return route mattered as much as the original reconstruction. By that point, the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel was no longer just a domestic experiment held together by admiration for old portraits and selective breeding choices. It had become something sturdier, portable, and legible enough to travel. A dog that had been assembled through intention could now be introduced back into the landscape that had inspired its image. That movement is important, because it shows how the breed's identity was not fixed in one room, one kennel, or one generation. It was being negotiated across borders, carried by people who saw value in preserving a particular silhouette, a certain softness in the face, a specific way of looking at a human hand and asking for closeness. The United Kingdom had given the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel its symbolic language, but the United States became part of its practical future. This was not a relic passively admired from a distance. It was a living design, refined enough to be exported and convincing enough to be imported back as proof of continuity. That reversal tells you something precise. Popularity did not simply arise from ancient prestige. It was built through circulation, through exchange, through the willingness of breeders and owners to treat a recreated form as worthy of renewed attention. And once that first dog arrived in Britain in 1956, the breed's modern story gained a quieter but decisive momentum. The image that had once belonged to nostalgia alone now had movement, and movement is what gives a lineage social power. A creature can be elegant in a painting and still remain inert there. Once it enters homes, shows, and breeding programs, it becomes part of a wider agreement. People begin choosing it, asking for it, comparing it, carrying forward the traits they want to keep. The charm stops being only symbolic and starts becoming a pattern of daily preference. That is why the 1956 crossing matters so much. It exposes a second layer beneath the official recognition and beneath the historical reconstruction. After the standard was stabilized, the next task was dissemination. A breed does not live only by being named. It lives by being moved, seen, desired, and repeated in new places until the idea of it feels natural. In this case, the path ran from Britain to America and back again, as if the breed had to be sent out into the world and returned to its point of origin in order to prove that the reconstruction held. The quiet paradox is this: the more carefully the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel was shaped, the more easily it could travel. Its stability made it exportable. Its beauty made it desirable. Its history made it persuasive. And when W. Lyon Brown brought that first one home in 1956, he was not just transporting a dog, he was helping seal the moment when a revived ideal began to behave like a real, shareable lineage. Listen closely to that shift, and the whole picture becomes sharper. The breed's recent history is not a straight line from palace to present. It is a sequence of recoveries, institutional decisions, and deliberate crossings that transformed a remembered type into something that could circulate with confidence. If you are seeing the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel differently now, stay with that feeling, because the final layer is where this elegant reconstruction meets the deeper question of what people were trying to preserve all along. In 1995, the final seal arrived in a place that had become impossible to ignore: the United States. According to Wikipedia's entry on the King Charles Spaniel, the American Kennel Club officially recognized the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel as a distinct breed that year, and in doing so became the breed's parent club in that country. That detail sounds administrative on paper, but in the living history of the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, it lands like a verdict. The image may have looked old for decades, yet the legitimacy people now associate with it was still being settled at the end of the 20th century. That is the point where the sentimental myth begins to fracture in a new way. A breed sold to the public as a continuation of courtly grace had to wait until 1995 for its most influential American recognition. Not because it lacked appeal, not because it lacked a following. It waited because the identity itself was still being organized, verified, and protected through institutions that decide what counts as a breed and what remains only a cherished type. The American Kennel Club did not inherit a finished relic from the age of Charles II. It accepted a modern reconstruction that had already traveled through revival, selection, and standardization. Seen from that angle, the American recognition does more than add another date. It exposes the rhythm of the entire breed, remembered, rebuilt, exported, then finally anchored. The Cavalier King Charles Spaniel crossed the Atlantic, carrying a face that seemed to belong to another century, but the paperwork behind that face belonged to the present. That tension matters. It means the dog's elegance was never simply preserved. It was ratified, line by line, by people who agreed that this exact combination of size, expression, and temperament deserved to stand apart from the other spaniels. And once that happens, the old fantasy changes shape. A dog that appears to have stepped out of a portrait is revealed as a carefully maintained agreement between taste and rule. The long ears, the soft outline, the affectionate manner, the compact body that makes the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel feel almost like a moving piece of domestic history. All of it now reads differently when you know how late the international seal actually came. The breed did not drift into acceptance on the strength of royal memory. It entered the largest market by passing through a modern gate. That late acceptance also explains why the Cavalier could become so widely understood so quickly. By 1995, the public image was already polished enough to feel inevitable, but the official acknowledgement showed that inevitability had been manufactured. It was the result of sustained breeding choices, breed club pressure, and a growing consensus that the revived form had become stable enough to protect. In other words, the United States did not merely receive a fashionable companion, it received the proof that a recreated lineage could succeed as a modern breed. Hold that thought, because it sharpens the deeper paradox. If the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel had truly survived unchanged from the royal age so often invoked in its marketing, its validation would have looked very different. Instead, the timeline exposes a much more human process. People remembered an ideal, pursued it, argued over it, and finally granted it official status when the shape was convincing enough to stand on its own. That is why 1995 matters so much. It is not a footnote. It is the moment when nostalgia stopped pretending to be ancestry and became institution. And now, the breed's image carries a second life. It is admired not only for what it seems to recall, but for what its history quietly proves. That modern dog breeding can rebuild a lost aesthetic so successfully that an entire public accepts it as heritage. The Cavalier King Charles Spaniel reached the biggest stage with a past that had been curated into credibility. That is why its rise feels so polished, and why it also feels slightly haunting. Because once you notice the timing, you can no longer look at the face and see only nobility. You see a reconstruction that worked so well it entered the world as if it had always been there. And that raises the final question, the one that sits beneath every ribbon, every registry, every polished photograph. If this breed became what people wanted by design, what exactly were they preserving when they claimed to preserve the past? A quiet room, a glossy coat, and a face so carefully composed that it seems to carry centuries inside it. That is how the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel still enters the imagination. Polished, gentle, almost suspended in time. But in 2018, a genetic study pushed that image off balance. According to cavalierhealth.org, the breed showed a homogeneity score of 0.90, the highest among 23 breeds tested. A number that high does not whisper continuity. It suggests compression. It suggests a lineage narrowed so tightly that much of what people admire today sits on a remarkably limited genetic base. If you are interested in the deeper data behind these genetic bottlenecks and how to navigate the health landscape of this breed, I've linked a comprehensive guide in the description and first comment that breaks down the specific genetic markers you should know. That detail changes the entire mood of the story, because a breed can look historic and still be genetically recent in the only sense that matters here. Not born from untouched inheritance, but shaped through repeated choice until variation became scarce. The Cavalier King Charles Spaniel did not arrive as a wide, ancient river of blood running unchanged through the centuries. It emerged more like a canal, carefully guided, cleaned, and constrained by human hands. The beautiful uniformity people notice in the ring, in portraits, in family homes, is part of the clue. What looks refined on the outside often means reduced on the inside. The study does not erase the breed's charm. It explains why that charm feels so consistent. When genetic diversity is low, traits can become steadier from one generation to the next. The round expression, the silk-textured coat, the compact frame, the soft demeanor that made the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel such a treasured companion, All of it becomes easier to stabilize when breeders work from a narrow foundation and keep selecting the same favored features. In other words, the dog's elegance is not evidence of a passive past. It is the visible result of pressure, preference, and repetition. And that is where the story becomes more intimate than a register or a pedigree chart. Every time a breeder chose one puppy over another for a slightly sweeter face, a calmer temperament, a more balanced outline, the future of the breed narrowed a little more. Not because anyone set out to make the line fragile, but because success in appearance often rewards sameness. The Cavalier King Charles Spaniel became dependable in the very way people wanted. Predictable in look, familiar in behavior, easy to recognize. Yet the 0.90 score suggests that this dependability came at a cost paid quietly over generations. There is a deeper irony in that result. The breed was revived to recover an older feeling, a remembered style of companionship associated with courts, portraits, and lap-sized elegance. But the genetic picture shows that what survived was never a frozen relic. It was a reconstruction that had to be made stable enough to be accepted as tradition. The more convincingly the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel resembled the ideal, the more its internal diversity was pushed aside. The past was not simply preserved, it was edited into a narrower shape. That is why the number matters so much. A homogeneity of 0.90, especially as the highest among 23 breeds in the study, is not a decorative fact. It is a warning written in the language of inheritance. It tells us that behind the softness of the face and the nobility of the name lies a base that is limited, concentrated, and highly curated. As Axelsson et al. 2021 demonstrated in PLOS genetics, the breed carries a higher burden of harmful genetic variants compared to other breeds, a direct consequence of intense, bottlenecked breeding practices. If this has given you a new way to see the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, stay with the story, because the next layer is even more revealing. Once a breed becomes this uniform, the question is no longer only where it came from, but what kind of future was built into it while everyone was admiring the past. A young Cavalier King Charles Spaniel can look almost unreal in stillness, with those soft eyes and that polished royal outline. But beneath the elegance, the skull can hold a different story. In 2004, seminal research by Rusbridge and Nola, 2004, confirmed the hereditary nature of occipital bone hyperplasia and Chiari-like malformation, identifying a clear genetic link to the breed's skull morphology. The problem is not cosmetic. It narrows the area around the foramen magnum, the opening where the brain meets the spinal cord, and that crowding can lead to syringomyelia, a painful disorder in which fluid-filled cavities form inside the spinal cord. What looked like a refined head shape was revealing something far less romantic, a structure shaped by inheritance, not just style. Then the picture deepened again. In 2005, a study published in the Journal of Heredity reported that occipital hyperplasia and syringomyelia in the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel were inherited conditions, with a high incidence in certain families linked to consanguinity. That detail changes the emotional weight of the entire breed. It means the same selective narrowness that helped preserve a desired appearance also concentrated risk inside the bloodline. The beauty was not only inherited, so was the vulnerability, and that is the cruel precision of the breed's history. The more tightly the line was guarded, the more likely the hidden flaw could travel with it. A family resemblance that once felt like proof of continuity became evidence of pressure, of repeated choices made in small circles, generation after generation. No wonder breeders and veterinarians began to speak about the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel with a tone that mixed affection and concern. The face remained familiar, but the meaning of that face had changed. What makes this even more striking is that the illness does not arrive as an accident outside the story. It sits inside the same reconstruction that gave the breed its modern identity. The rounder, shorter, more delicate head that many people associate with charm can be part of the very architecture that increases the risk of crowding at the base of the skull, so the feature admired in a living room portrait can also be the feature that, deep inside the body, turns into pain. That is why this breed cannot be understood as a simple heirloom from the past. It is a living record of selection, and the record is written in bone, nerve, and family lines. The historical image says continuity. The medical evidence says consequence. One tells us what people wanted to see. The other tells us what the body kept. Stay with that tension, because it leads to the hardest truth of all. Once a breed is narrowed enough to look like a tradition, it can also become narrow enough to carry its own damage forward without anyone noticing at first. In 2011, researchers at the Animal Health Trust, including Foreman et al., 2012, mapped the mutation to the FAM-AG3H gene, which causes curly coat or dry eye, CKCSID, a severe autosomal recessive disorder. That discovery mattered because it moved a visible trait out of the realm of guesswork and into the language of inheritance. A coat that looked unusual was not simply a quirky detail of appearance, it was a biological signal with a traceable cause. And then, in 2012, that signal became practical. The Animal Health Trust began offering DNA tests to detect the mutation responsible for the condition, helping breeders identify affected dogs and carriers. That moment changed the conversation again. The breed was no longer being judged only by what could be seen in a show ring or admired in a portrait. Its hidden structure could now be read in a laboratory, and choices about future litters could be made with a level of precision that would have sounded impossible only a generation earlier. This is where the picture sharpens. The Cavalier King. Charles Spaniel was not merely shaped by taste in the distant past. It was being monitored, sorted, and corrected in the present. A coat pattern, an inherited disorder, a carrier state, all of it became part of the same story of managed reproduction. What looked graceful on the outside carried information on the inside, and that information could be followed, tested, and used to guide the breed forward. But the genetic story did not stop with one visible trait. In 2020, a genomic association study identified specific variants in the DNA of the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel connected to alanine aminotransferase, or ALT, and to stress during physical examinations. That finding pushed the breed's story into a deeper layer. Even the way some dogs responded under pressure, even a biochemical measure tied to routine veterinary handling, showed a heritable pattern. The body was not only telling a story through shape, it was telling one through reaction. Taken together, these discoveries undo the illusion of a fixed, untouched lineage. The modern Cavalier King Charles Spaniel is not a relic that survived without alteration. It is a breed whose visible beauty, coat texture, medical vulnerability, and even measured physiological responses can all be traced through selective breeding and modern DNA research. The old image of effortless continuity loses its force here. In its place stands something more exacting and more human, a line of animals shaped, refined, tested, and reinterpreted across time. That is why the breed feels so powerful now. Not because it escaped history, but because history was written into it again and again. The face that once seemed like a preserved inheritance is better understood as a carefully assembled result. The elegance remains real. The companionship remains real. But the myth of untouched ancestry does not survive contact with the evidence. And once that becomes clear, the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel stops looking like a symbol of pure past and starts looking like proof that selection can remake identity without erasing charm. If you want to see how far that process reaches, keep following the trail of what breeding can reveal, because the next layer is even harder to ignore. The same hand that preserved the look also shaped the limits of the body, and the line between beauty and consequence is thinner than it first appeared.